Butterfly Project aims to use education, the arts, and memorial making to remember the 1.5 million children who were killed during the Holocaust. So our hope is that by using the symbol of the butterfly and talking to children about children, it'll help them to connect to these things that happened in history. And at the same time, we can connect to what is happening today to be able to show patterns of hatred that existed during that time, that existed even before the Holocaust even occurred, and that still exist today, so that we can then have the conversation about how to interrupt those patterns to create a more peaceful future for everyone. We use the ADL's Pyramid of Hate, which helps to show how biased attitudes can turn into biased actions, which can then turn into discrimination and move all the way up to genocide if they are not interrupted at each step of the way. We begin our program with a survivor story. We have 2 survivors that work with our program. One is Irving Bienstock. He has celebrated his 98th birthday this past June, which was amazing. He is still telling his story and answering questions. And then we have Suly Chenkin, who is celebrating her 84th birthday this year, I believe. And they sort of alternate days, which we think is fabulous because while we are seeing several students from the same school, they're not all hearing the same story. And Irving's story, Irving was born in 1926 in Germany, so he kind of tells us what it was like in the beginning. And then Suly is not born until 1940, and she's in Lithuania. So their stories and experiences are very, very different, and it gives our students different understanding of what the Holocaust was like in these 2 very different places and how it affected everyone. And then, of course, the students have an opportunity to ask questions, which is my favorite part of the workshop because they ask the most amazing questions. And oftentimes there might be students that seem like they're not really paying attention. Maybe they have their eyes closed or they're not looking at the screen, but that's usually who comes up with the most profound questions. So it's just really interesting as a teacher to watch the students watch these films and experience the survivors. And then after that, we divide our groups in half, and they will paint a butterfly in memory of a specific child who was killed during the Holocaust. They get a certificate that has the title of our program, the name of the child that they are remembering. So everyone is painting for a unique individual. And we get those names from Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust Museum in Israel.
My name is Irving Bienstock. I was born in Dortmund, Germany. My parents were middle class, and I had a younger sister by the name of Sylvia. We lived in a small apartment house which was owned by my grandmother. And in addition to my grandmother, I had aunts and uncles and cousins who also had apartments in the same building. My parents came from Austria-Hungary. Today it's part of the Ukraine, and in between it was part of Poland. My father had a good job. He was an accountant, and he worked for clients who are most of Jewish businesses in Dortmund. And life was good for us. My mother didn't work. My mother was a housekeeper. There was a bakery across the street, which we were very friendly with, a grocery store right around the corner. And we knew all these people. And I used to play with the kids in the area. And so we were very friendly with our neighbors. Till on the election, then it changed overnight. My whole life changed. I didn't have any friends to play with anymore, and my only friend was my cousin Herman. They started wearing swastikas, flying swastika flags. All of a sudden, Nazis in brown uniforms and swastika armbands, and they were called the SA, which meant Sturmabteilung or storm divisions. I saw them driving around in an open truck, and they would grab any Jewish men they would find out in the street, and they would beat them up for no other reason than the fact we're Jewish. I could not go to a regular school anymore. I had to go to a Jewish school. They started a boycott of Jewish businesses, and they would paint on the windows of the businesses, This is a Jewish business. Germans fight against it. Don't patronize these businesses. As a community, we were very, very scared and very concerned about what was happening and what was going to be next. I really couldn't be a real kid as kids are today. We were Jewish and for some reason they hated us. My father one Sunday took me to an operetta. When we got there was a sign there, Juden verboten, Jews not allowed. So we turned around and we went home. New laws had been passed and Jews could no longer attend movies, theaters, parks and recreation facilities. Were all forbidden to Jews. My father left immediately. My father hired a smuggler and smuggled him into Belgium. My sister and I had gone to school that morning, and when we came home in the afternoon, my father was gone. And my mother got my sister and I together, and she says, and people ask her to come question us, we don't know where Papa is, and in fact we didn't. So that night my mother took all the photos that we had that had my father's picture in them, and she burned them. Shortly thereafter, the Gestapo came, looking for my father. So my mother said to them, my husband went to work. If he's not there, then you must have him. What did you do to him? And they came back every day. Every morning they came back, same question, mother gave them the same answers. And after about a week, they figured that he was gone, that they left us alone. I had a very close relationship with my father, and so did my sister. We were devastated, we were shocked, but we realized that he had to do that to save his life and ours. Well, Kristallnacht came about when they arrested, I believe, some 30,000 Polish Jews in Germany. The Nazi police came at 5:30 and knocked on our door. Told my mother, get dressed, go to the police station. They're going to ship you back to Poland. So my mother said, no, we're not Polish citizens. My grandmother, my aunts and uncles, and my cousins, they had to go. They put them on a train, and they shipped them back to Poland. Among the people that they deported that day was a family by the name of Greenspan. The Greenspan had a son, his name was Herschel Greenspan. He lived in Paris. When he learned what the Nazis had done to his parents, he got a gun, went to German embassy, and he shot the first secretary, his name was von Rath, mortally wounded him. He died, I think, the following night. We immediately realized that we were in big trouble. Joseph Goebbels got on the radio, the propaganda minister, and told the German people that the Jews must be punished for this crime. And the Nazis were gathering in the plaza during the night. I went to sleep. I was 12 years old. My sister was 10. Woke up with terrible noises in the street. So I asked my mother what's going on. My mother said to me, nothing, go back to sleep. There's some drunks out there. So I didn't believe that. I got up and I peered up from behind the curtain. I could see one of the synagogues right down the block was burning. And there were thousands of people in the street yelling, Juden raus and Juden verrecken, out with the Jews and exterminate them. I thought that we were going to die that night, that they were going to come into our house and kill us. And they did come into the house, a mob came to the house, and among them was a policeman. And they started to break furniture. We had a coal stove there in the house that had a poker. For the cold, they grabbed the poker and they started to smash all the dishes, crystal, windows. So my mother went to the policeman and said to him, you know, you're a policeman, you're supposed to protect us. He says, why are you allowing people to do this to us? So the policeman said to her, you dirty Jew, we want you to get out of Germany. After Kristallnacht, there was no longer any school. We just stayed in a house. One day, a man came to our house and told us that he was the new owner, that we no longer owned the house, and that we would have to get out. I saw myself and my mother and my sister being out in the street in the cold someplace, and I didn't have any place to go. We were going to die out there. About that time, they started the kinder transports, where England agreed to take 10,000 Jewish German children. For some reason, they did not take us. My mother was desperate, so she decided to put us on a train and send us to Holland on January the 15th, 1939. And we got to the border. She walked to the train with me, but none of the people on the train would help us. So we sat there, and then when we got to the border, the German border, an SS man came on board to check the passports. And he looked at my mother's passport and mine and took a passport away from her. And he knew what she was doing. He took her with him, but he let me stay on the train. And when we got to the Dutch border police came on board, checking passports. He looked at it, I had no visa, and he said to me, "Where are you going?" I said, "I'm going to visit my uncle in Amsterdam." So he says to me, "You're lying." And he was right, and he took me off the train. At that point, I thought he was going to send me back to Germany. And he had me sit down on a platform of the bench. The policeman came back with a Jewish man from Arnhem, and he took me to his house, and I stayed there overnight. And then the following morning, he took me by train to a children's home in Wijkenzee, which was a little village on the coast of Holland. There were other children there had come there by kinder transport. I didn't know why these kids were there. They're not in England, but they didn't ask any questions. And I found my sister there. We went to the dining hall to eat. I saw her. I didn't know she was there. Embraced her, hugged her. I was very, very thrilled that I found my sister, that she was alive and where she was, and we were together. I got there January 17th, January 18th in Wijkenzee. We stayed in that children's home until March 22nd, 1939, a little bit over 2 months. And then they divided us up. The older boys and girls were sent to a place in The Hague, and the rest of us, the younger ones, we were sent to an orphanage in Amsterdam. When I got to the orphanage in Amsterdam, I asked the director if I could go to the synagogue on Shabbat, on the Sabbath, and she said yes, and she sent somebody with me. After the services, I went over to the rabbi, and I told him who I was. I was supposed to be bar mitzvah on June the 24th. He was very happy that I came to him, and he said, yes, you will be bar mitzvah. And he sent a teacher to the orphanage to teach me to read 3 lines from the Torah. And on the 24th, I was bar mitzvah. It was bittersweet because I had no family. My parents weren't there. My grandmother wasn't there. My father was in Belgium, and after I left, my mother hired a smuggler to smuggle into Belgium. She was caught the first time by the Germans, and she spent the night in jail. She tried again the following night, and she made it into Belgium. So my parents were then in Belgium, and we were in Holland. When Hitler came into power, my father realized that there was no place for us in Germany anymore, and that we had to get out. So he went to the German consulate in Stuttgart, in Germany, and registered for a quota number. The United States at the time had a very restrictive quota system. So even though he registered for quota in 1933, his number didn't come up until 1938, 1939, when he was in Belgium. And my father came to the United States in June of 1939. Now, once he was in the United States, He found a sponsor for my mother, my sister, and myself, and we actually got our visas to come to the United States in March of 1940. My mother came from Belgium to Rotterdam, and we were reunited with my mother, my sister, and myself, when we boarded the ship. I was thrilled to see my mother again, my sister. It was a very scary crossing because right after we left, the Germans invaded Denmark and Norway. And we were afraid they might intercept the ship and send us back. We hit a very bad storm. My mother was very sick. It took 12 days, and we arrived in New York on April the 17th, 1940. The Germans invaded Holland after 4 weeks later, and we were probably among the last ship to leave Holland for the United States. My father was there, and we were together again. America was still in a depression. He couldn't be an accountant here. There were different laws. He went peddling, selling men's underwear, socks, and shirts. At 17 years, I wanted to join the army. I spoke to my mother once, and she said to me, "I saved your life once. I don't want to lose you now." But I wanted to be part of it. This was my country. When I was 18, I went to the draft board. I was there at 7 o'clock in the morning. That was June 15th, my birthday, and I was accepted for service in the Army. In March of 1945, I was shipped overseas, across the Atlantic, and it was exactly 5 years from the day I left Rotterdam. It was exactly 5 years. On April the 5th, 1945. We arrived in Naples, Italy, and we were sent to a replacement depot. They replaced the casualties that occurred on the front lines. And I was standing there, formation, first night, lowering the flag, and they're playing the Star Spangled Banner. I cried. Here was an American citizen, I was a soldier in the United States Army, going to fight the Germans. It was overwhelming. And I was very lucky I came home alive. I got out of the Army in August of 1946. I hadn't finished high school because I had not gone to school for a year and a half, so I had to make up some time. I became an engineer for a Singer company. I became a plant manager for a plant that we had in Ozone Park, Queens. And they decided to close the plant in New York and move it to Monroe, North Carolina. And they asked me to move the plant. And we moved to Charlotte in 1975. That's how I got here. The year 2000, I retired, and I started to look at my life, what I was going to do. And I thought about my earlier life, what had happened to us and what the Nazis did to us. And I realized that once I'm gone, nobody will know what happened to 6 million of my brethren. I decided that I would start telling my story to school children. I really never lost hope. One of the last thing my mother told me, as the SS man was taking her away, she said to me, "Be brave, and in the end," she said, "everything will be good. Alles wird gut sein. Everything will be good." And I remember that, and I always had hope that someday I would see my parents again, and I never give up hope. She said to me, "Be brave, and am Ende alles wird gut sein. Everything will be good."
My name now is Suly Chenkin, but I was born Shulamit Alexandra Baikovich in the town of Kaunas, or how the Jews called it, and the Russians Kovno, which was then the provisional capital of Lithuania. I was 8 months old when the Nazis broke their pact with Russia and attacked Russia by coming into Kovno. We had our own identity there because basically the Lithuanians were very anti-Semitic. We had, I'm told, 40 synagogues, our own banks, our own business places, and it was quite a nice place for people to live. Right away things changed for us. Came the Nuremberg laws. No Jew should walk on the sidewalk, no Jew can take a streetcar, no Jewish person can go to public places. Jews have to wear a yellow Star of David in the front of the back of their clothes. And then eventually, a few weeks later, the order came for Jews to relocate to a designated area. And the designated area was in the poorest part of town. At that time, only about maybe 10,000 people lived there, and they crammed about 34,000 of us. So you can imagine things were really, really very bad. The first months, people died of hunger, of malnutrition, of disease, and of selections. The Nazis came in and just rounded up people and took them away, never to be seen again. And the worst part was that nobody knew what was coming next. And we lived in a house with another 7 families. We had this little tiny room, and we were lucky to have a room. And my father, like everybody else, had to work for the Nazis. If you didn't work, you didn't eat. And because he was respected and well-liked, somebody got him the job of being in charge of the bread distribution in the ghetto. And it was a very difficult job. On October 28th, 1941, all over the ghetto they posted a notice that said that all the inmates had to present themselves at this open square called Democrat Square in the middle of the ghetto, and stand by family units, and that anybody who would be caught in their homes after 6 o'clock, homes which had to be left unlocked, would be shot on sight. And so it was, I'm told, a drizzly cold day, and my parents took turns in holding me for the next 10 hours. This election started, you go to the right and you go to the left, and in this manner they separated some 10,000 people, mostly children under the age of 12, the elderly, the sick, the handicapped. And they were taken away, never to be seen again. My parents and I were the rest of those who had been left, and we kept on living and hoping. From that day on, I was not allowed to leave the house because there were no children left in the ghetto. And on May 11th, 1944, I was given a sleeping potion. I was put in a potato sack right in front of the Nazi officers. I was placed on a cart that had other sacks that contained real potatoes. My father gave the driver the order signed by his boss, who did not know about this operation at all, which allowed the cart to take those sacks to the grinding mill in the outskirts of the ghetto to grind the potatoes into potato flour to bake potato bread for the ghetto. The driver set out and made an unscheduled stop in the outskirts of the ghetto. On the other side of the barbed wire stood Miriam Schulman and a young girl, and she was a young Christian girl that was going to take me. I was still sleeping. My sack was gently thrown over the barbed wire. The 2 women ran, tore it open, and put me in a carriage and wheeled me away to what everybody hoped was a chance to live. My parents had sent me out in the nick of time. This was May 11th. On July 13th or 14th, the inmates that were left were marched throughout the whole city and taken to the train station. The men and women were separated. The train that took the women went to a concentration camp called Stutthof in Poland. It was nearby. It was only 250 miles away from Kovno. But the men were taken to Dachau concentration camp in Germany. And I stayed in Lithuania, not really knowing what was going on, but just trying to keep my mouth shut. And I was 3.5 years old. My war ended in no time, because I was given up May 11th, and on July 31st to August 1st, the Russians came in and liberated Kovno. But my parents were gone. Nobody knew where. So Miriam took me to live with her. She took the rest of the children she had placed, and she had placed many. She put them in an orphanage. But I had endeared myself to her, so she brought me to live with her and her 2 girls and son. And in January, it being one of the coldest months recorded in Europe, at that time, we left with false documentation, went to Poland, Lublin. From Lublin, we went to Bienstock. From Bienstock, we had to return back to Lublin for some or other reason. Then finally, after months and months of traveling, it took us 10 months to get from Lithuania to Romania, because Romania had the port city of Constanza, where we were going to take a boat to go to what was then Palestine. And on the month of my 5th birthday, I boarded a ship that brought us to Palestine. Months went by, and I was getting used to living in Israel. Even though it was the British mandate and there was still shooting here and there, and skirmishes and all that, I felt pretty free. I used to, at 5 years old, I'd take the bus all by myself, cross a busy street in Jerusalem and go to kindergarten. My mother had survived. She had been liberated by the Russian army on January 31st, 1944, when this young man came to the camp. He was Lithuanian Jew, and the women milled around him, and they asked him, "Where do you come from?" "Oh, I come from Kovno." "So tell me, how come you survived?" "Well, I was in hiding. I escaped the ghetto before they torched it." "Well, who else was in hiding that came out? Who's left there?" And he starts enumerating people, and then he says, "You know, the rabbi's wife, Miriam Schulman, she's alive. She saved her three children and other children, and now she's making her way to Israel with her children. And you remember the red-headed guy who was in charge of the bread distribution in the ghetto? She's got his kid with her." My mother fainted. It was the first news that she had that I had made it. 2 days later, my mother escaped the camp, right in front of the guy with a machine gun. She said she was going to the well to get some water, and she made a run for it. She hid in some garden, and when nightfall came, she knocked on the door of the Polish people and begged them until finally they took her in, and they were very nice. They waited a few days, and when they felt they weren't looking for her anymore, they went to the village, took her to the village, bought her a ticket on a broken down cart, truck, whatever, and broken down trains, trucks, buses. My mother made her way to Lodz, which is where we were supposed to be. This young man said we were on our way to Lodz, in a city in Poland. She got there, and she went to the office, the joint distribution, which kept tabs on survivors and their whereabouts. The man told her, "Oh, they're already on the boat to Israel." My mother came out, and she was crying, because she figured, here she was, all she had was his torn shoes, this dress, no underwear. She was sick from malnutrition and frostbite, and she couldn't swim the ocean. She would never see me again. When these two young boys came by and recognized her and turned around and said, "Hey, aren't you Riva Bakovitz? Your husband is alive. He's in Munich, working for the Americans. He knows you're alive. Your name is on the list. And he's waiting for you to come to him." Sure, my father thought my mother is going to be smart enough not to think that he was going to leave the American side to come to the Russian side and never be able to get out again. So my mother and these two fellows started their trek from Lodz to Munich, and it was very difficult because, again, no papers, no money, no food, sick. So they finally got to the border that separated the Russian sector from the American sector. And if you did not have documents that showed that you lived in Munich before the war, you were sent back to the Russian sector, to the communist area. So of course these two people and my mother had this makeshift documents that a child would recognize as false, and they were put on the train that was going back to Poland. And the two guys and my mother, they climbed to the roof of the train, and when the train that they had been taken off passed them by, the three of them jumped from the roof of one moving train to the roof of the other moving train, and that's how my mother got together and reunited with my dad. My dad had been liberated by the American Army from Dachau, and at that time, on a frame of close to 5'10", he weighed 80 pounds. He would not have survived another week. But luckily, the Americans came in time. And he was working for them. He knew my whereabouts. He knew I was on my way to Israel. He knew my mother would be smart enough to come to him. And the rest of the family, his brothers, save one in his family, but all the others had migrated to Cuba years before. My father was the baby in the family, so he had stayed with his mother. And that's how we got caught in the war. He had written many letters to Cuba, and one of them arrived. Well, that particular brother had died of a massive heart attack at the age of 40 or 41, and his widow had moved. But the Cuban people are very warm, wonderful people and caring. And the mailman kept looking, and he said, "Boy, this really has such a beautiful stamp. It must come from such a faraway place. I'm not just going to take it to the post office. There is a Jewish person who has a store here. I'm going to take it. Maybe he knows the rest of the family, and he knows who this can go to." So sure enough, the man did know the family. Most Jewish people knew each other in Havana. And he called my uncle, my father's brother. And my uncle thought, oh, this must be, it comes from Paris, because somebody mailed it for my father from Paris. It comes from Paris. It must be one of the widow's cousins that lives there. Just open the letter and tell me who it is, who's writing it. And the guy says, it's signed your brother Zalman. And that's how my family in Cuba found out that we were alive and that I existed. And so my uncle immediately procured papers that allowed my parents to leave Germany. They went to Paris. My uncle picked them up in Paris, brought them to Cuba. Remember, it was very difficult to get papers to come into what was then Palestine. The British were not giving certificates. And so once in Cuba, my mother applied for a transit visa to go to Israel. My father was too sick to travel. And she took, family accompanied her to New York, where she took a freighter that was a merchant marine ship. Was the only method they could find to get to where she was going. And on the month of my 6th birthday, I came running. I was at a play date in the old city of Jerusalem, And my older foster brother and sister came and said, Ema wants to speak to you. And Ema, if she wanted to speak to you, it was because you were going to be punished for something or other. And we went to the house, and I came running around the bend screaming, Ema, Ema, I'm here, and I didn't do anything. And this lady came out, and she stopped in her tracks. And I stopped in mine, and then I ran into her arms in full recognition of my mother, who had finally come to get me. And 2.5 years had passed by, and we stayed in Israel waiting for documents to be issued to me, and it took forever. And finally, on February 6th, 1947, my mother and I traveled to Cuba, and I was reunited with my father. And it was a big to-do. We were in the newspaper because out of the 30-something thousand Jewish people who had lived at that time, only 2,000 remained, 5%. Out of children under the age of 12, only 3% of the children survived, 153. And our family had been left intact, and it was a miracle. My father had me go to an American school from 4th grade on, so I was fluent in English. It was a better English than I probably speak now because it had no slang words. And I came to Miami. I had some relatives in Miami. My parents sent me out again. It was, I came back from the university, and they had been shooting from the rooftops, anti-Castro people, and the kid that was giving me a ride home had pushed me to the ground and to the cobblestones, and bloody knees and bloody hands, and I was shaking. And the next day my father came with a ticket, and he said, you got 3 days to pack. You're going on the Thursday plane to Miami. And he felt he was sending me out for the time being. But a few months later, all the major businesses in Cuba were confiscated by the Castro regime. And so my parents in October came out. I came out July 60, and they came in October. And we lived in Miami, and we thought we were coming back to Cuba because the United States would send the Marines. But the United States years later sent them to Vietnam. And so we came here to Charlotte, and I stayed here for a while, and there was nothing much doing here for me. And so I went to New York, and I got a job. Export-import office, because I had my Spanish, English, and my Yiddish, which also helped with the job at some Canal Street. And I called my father and I said, I got a very, very high position. And he said, how much are you making? And I said, $70 a week. And he said, boy, that's lousy. I mean, you were making that in Miami. I said, but I'm on the 75th floor of the Empire State Building. So, you know. And that summer, my mother came to visit me, and she came up to the office, and it was getting dark already, and we were by the window, and all the lights were coming on, and she turned around to me, and she said, you know, she said, here you are. You survived Hitler, and you're on top of the world.